I was 14 when my life took a dark turn. After my parents died in a car crash, the state decided I couldn't take care of myself, so they sent me to a foster home. The place was far from anything that resembled a home. It was a crumbling mansion in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a forest so thick you couldn't see the sky through the trees. When I first arrived, Mrs. Vera, the foster mother, seemed nice enough. She was this old woman with sharp eyes, always moving quickly as if she had too much to do and too little time. There were 10 other kids living there, but something was off about them. They barely spoke and moved like they were trapped in a trance. Their eyes glazed over like they were somewhere else entirely. It wasn't long before I noticed their obsession with candy. Bowls of the stuff sat in every room, piles of colorful sweets. At first I thought it was a treat. Who wouldn't? I mean, we were kids and candy was candy. But they didn't just eat it occasionally. They devoured it like it was the only thing keeping them alive. I tried some too, but after a while, it started to make me feel weird, too calm, too relaxed, like I was floating outside my body. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Mrs. Vera had a helper, a guy named Carl. He was around 50, with greasy hair and an unsettling smile that always lingered too long. Carl was everywhere. He'd pop up at random times, never knocking before entering our rooms, and he watched us constantly during meals. His eyes would linger, not just on the candy, but on us. Something about him made my skin crawl, but the other kids didn't seem to care. They were too wrapped up in those damn sweets. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone crying. Quiet sobs echoed through the hallway, so I got up to see what was happening. I followed the sound to one of the other kids' rooms. Lily, I think her name was. She was one of the quiet ones, always keeping to herself. When I peeked through the crack in the door, I saw Carl standing over her, whispering something. Lily was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "No, please, not again," she whimpered. "I don't want to. If you don't do what I say, you won't get the candy anymore." Carl hissed, his voice low and threatening. "You'll be left with nothing. Understand?" That's when it hit me. He was using the candy to control them. Whatever was in it, they were addicted to it. And Carl, he was the dealer, keeping the kids hooked so they'd do whatever he wanted. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up. I had to get out of there, had to stop him, but I couldn't do it alone. The next day, I started watching the other kids, trying to figure out how deep this went. It didn't take long to notice just how much power Carl had over them. They'd do anything for him, clean his shoes, give him back rubs, even let him into their rooms late at night. And it was all for the candy. I had to act. That night, when Carl wasn't around, I gathered the other kids and told them what I'd seen. They looked at me with blank faces at first. Their minds dulled from the sweets, but then I showed them the stash of pills I'd found hidden behind the candy jars in the pantry. Slowly, their faces changed. Confusion turned to fear and then to anger. They realized they'd been used, manipulated. When Carl came into the room later that night, he didn't stand a chance. We jumped on him, hitting, kicking, doing everything we could to make him stop. He screamed for Mrs. Vera, but she didn't come right away. Maybe she didn't care, or maybe she was scared herself. When she finally did burst in, she was horrified by what she saw. But for once, she did the right thing. She called the cops. Carl was arrested that night, taken away in handcuffs while we watched from the windows. The mansion shut down soon after, and we were all sent to a hospital to detox, to get clean from whatever it was they'd been feeding us. It wasn't easy. Some of the kids took longer than others, but eventually, we all made it through. Now, years later, I've moved on, or at least, I've tried to. But every time I see a piece of candy, it brings back the memories of that old decaying mansion and the horrors we lived through. Sometimes, I still get letters from the other kids, reminders of what we survived. We all made it out, but some things, they never really leave you. I was 11 when I arrived at the Johnsons' house. At first, I thought I had finally found a safe place. The house looked perfect, straight out of a magazine. White picket fence, neatly trimmed garden, and a porch swing. Mrs. Johnson was always smiling, and Mr. Johnson would pat me on the shoulder and tell me how proud he was of my progress at school. It felt like a real home. But soon, strange things started happening. Every few nights, a mysterious woman would visit. She always came late. When the house was quiet, Mrs. Johnson's smile would become tense, and she would hurriedly send me upstairs before answering the door. I wasn't allowed to see or hear anything, but one night, curiosity got the better of me, and I sneaked a glance from the stairs. The woman stood at the door, looking anxious. She was wearing a worn-out coat, and her eyes darted nervously. Mrs. Johnson quickly ushered her in, and together they went to the small storage room under the stairs. What chilled me the most was that they locked the woman in there. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would they lock her up? Who was she? I didn't dare ask. The uneasy feeling in my gut told me something was very wrong. Over the next few weeks, things became even stranger. Mr. Johnson would disappear late at night, and when he came back, his shoes were always covered in dirt. Mrs. Johnson seemed to grow more and more stressed, constantly on edge, and she started getting phone calls at odd hours. She'd lower her voice when talking, but I could hear snippets of conversation. Words like delivery and last chance kept coming up. One night, when the woman came again, I decided to follow them. This time, I snuck down the stairs and watched as they locked her in the storage room again. But instead of going back to my room, I crept closer to the door. That's when I realized the woman wasn't just a visitor. She was part of something much darker. Later that night, I overheard a heated argument between Mrs. Johnson and the woman. The woman sounded scared. "I don't want to do this anymore. It's getting too dangerous. We're going to get caught." Mrs. Johnson's voice was cold. "You don't have a choice. You're in this as deep as we are. If you don't keep doing your part, you know what will happen." That's when it clicked. The woman wasn't a friend or a guest. She was part of a trafficking ring, working with the Johnsons to move foster children to buyers. The storage room was just a temporary holding place before the transaction. A few days later, I stumbled upon a small box hidden in the storage room. Inside were old worn children's clothes, much too small for any of us. They were stained with dirt and something else I didn't want to think about. I felt sick, my heart racing as I pieced it all together. The Johnsons weren't just fostering kids, they were selling them. I couldn't believe it. The more I observed, the clearer it became. The woman was a middleman taking the children after the Johnsons prepared them. They were disappearing, and I was next. One night, when Mr. Johnson left the house again, I followed him. He met a group of people in a secluded spot by the woods, and I watched as they exchanged what looked like a briefcase. I didn't know what was inside, but I knew it wasn't good. My heart pounded as I ran back to the house. I had to get out. That night, I packed what little I had and ran to the neighbors. I was shaking as I told them everything I had seen and heard. They called the police, and soon after, the investigation began. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. The Johnsons were part of a large human trafficking network. They used their foster home as a front to take in children, only to sell them later. The mysterious woman was their partner, responsible for transferring the children to buyers. They forged documents and fabricated stories about the kids being reunited with family or moved to another foster home, so no one would come looking for them. The Johnsons were arrested, and so was the woman. But even though they were caught, the nightmare they put us through still haunts me. I'll never forget the look on their faces when I thought they cared about me, all while planning to sell me like the others. Some faces hide the darkest secrets behind the kindest smiles. When Jake and I were sent to live with Mrs. Hawthorne, we were promised a fresh start, a chance to be part of a family again, to have a real home out in the countryside. The social workers said it was a peaceful place, away from the city noise, where we could breathe clean air and find some quiet. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. Mrs. Hawthorne's house was ancient, leaning under the weight of decades. The wood creaked with every step, and the air inside was thick with dust, like no one had cleaned it in years. Mrs. Hawthorne herself was strange too. She was supposed to be old, with silver hair and wrinkles, but her face looked disturbingly young, like she was somehow frozen in time, even though her hands were gnarled and bony. It didn't make sense. There were 3 other kids living there already, but none of us had been told about them before. They were quiet, too quiet, their eyes always downcast like they were trying to avoid being noticed. It gave me chills how they moved, slow, almost like they were sleepwalking. I asked Jake if he thought something was off, but he brushed it off. "They're just shy, Mia," he said. "We'll be fine." But as the days went on, I knew we weren't fine. The house itself seemed alive. Doors creaked open on their own, and shadows moved across the walls when no one was there. At night, I'd hear scratching sounds coming from the attic, like something was trying to claw its way out. The other kids never talked about it. And when I pressed one of them, Oliver, he just muttered, "Don't talk about it or the caretaker will know." Caretaker. I thought Mrs. Hawthorne was the caretaker, but Oliver's face paled when I said that, and he turned away, refusing to explain. That's when I realized there was more to this house than any of us knew. The other kids whispered when they thought no one was listening. They believed there was something in the attic, something that controlled Mrs. Hawthorne. They called it the caretaker, and it was the reason for all the strange things happening. I didn't want to believe them at first, but then I saw it with my own eyes. Every night, Mrs. Hawthorne would light dozens of candles and arrange them in a circle in the living room. She'd start chanting in a language I didn't understand, her voice rising and falling like the wind outside. The first time I saw it, I froze, unable to move as I watched her go through the ritual. Her voice became frantic, her eyes wide and glassy, like she was in a trance. And the worst part, the other kids, Oliver, Emma, and James, were getting weaker, their faces pale, eyes sunken, moving slower than ever, like the life was being drained out of them. One afternoon, while snooping around, I found an old photograph in a drawer. It showed Mrs. Hawthorne standing in front of the house, but the date on the photo said 1952. She looked exactly the same, young, no wrinkles, no sign of aging. My heart raced as I realized something unnatural was happening. I looped Jake in, and together we made a plan to find out what was in the attic. That night, we waited until Mrs. Hawthorne was deep in one of her rituals, chanting louder than ever before. The house seemed to pulse with dark energy, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing like they were alive. We snuck upstairs, our footsteps barely making a sound on the creaky floorboards. The attic door was locked, but Jake was always good at breaking locks. "Hurry," I whispered. "We need to do this before she notices." Jake fumbled with the lock, my heart pounding as I kept watch. Finally, it clicked open. Inside, the air was thick with a strange rotten smell. Jake struck a match, and the small flame illuminated something in the corner. Something huge. It wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. It towered over us, easily 10 feet tall, with red eyes that glowed in the darkness. Before we could react, Jake dropped the match in shock, and that's when I realized the attic floor was covered in gasoline. The fire ignited in an instant, flames roaring around us. In the middle of the blaze, I saw the creature, no, the caretaker, let out a deafening wail. We turned to run, but Mrs. Hawthorne was already there, Her eyes were pitch black, her mouth twisted into a horrifying snarl. "You think you can escape?" she hissed. "You're mine." Jake shoved me toward the stairs. "Run, Mia. I'll hold her off." I wanted to stay, to fight with him, but he pushed me down the steps. I looked back just in time to see the black entity and Mrs. Hawthorne merge into one. Huge claws grew from her fingers. As the fire roared around her, I ran to the other kids for help, but when I reached them, I froze in terror. Their eyes, Oliver, Emma, James, they were all black just like hers. That's when I realized the horrible truth. These children had been dead all along, their bodies kept alive by dark forces. The monsters, Mrs. Hawthorne and the entity in the attic, were sustaining themselves by consuming the children's blood, bones, or even their souls. That's how Mrs. Hawthorne remained eternally youthful, feeding off the life force of the children trapped in this house. The realization made my blood run cold. I could be next. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I reached the nearest neighbor's home. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the house had been reduced to ashes. They found the bodies of the other children buried in the yard, their eyes missing, but there was no trace of Jake or Mrs. Hawthorne. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. It's been 10 years, but I still see that house in my nightmares, and every time I do, I wonder if Jake is out there somewhere, fighting to keep the darkness at bay.